Thank you very much for joining us. I was not expecting to see this many people for something about the Kanban basics. I do not hope you're expecting some deep dive into some of the really hardcore mechanics, because this is really about the core principles and how I see that a lot of the things have just been left on the table in terms of getting the value out of the simple stuff. Very briefly about myself. My name is Jesper. I've been part of the community since 2009 or 10, part of the Iceland conference where we started up talking about lean Kanban in the first place. Some know me for the green Kanban book, Priming Kanban, which is available for free at InfoQ. It's from 2012. I'm an AKT, KCP. Used to head the department for Agile Excellence at a company called Trifork in Denmark. Last couple of years, I've worked at a digital agency to try something really different. And alongside with that, I was doing 2 to 3 days a month, some independent stuff. And now from February this year, I'm fully engaged in doing some coaching, training, that kind of stuff, again, as an independent. I've been working with Agile and Lean Process Optimization since 2006. I've done that in all kinds of contexts, from small startups and getting them up and running, getting a team established, a nice process set up to deliver value, to big, large organizations trying to change how hundreds and even thousands of people work. And of course, what you can sometimes do in a day for the small startup, it takes months or even years sometimes to do for the larger organizations. A bit about today. As I said, this is not going to be a deep dive. I'm going to talk about how I see that we can get more out of the basic 6 core principles. The main context of today's talk is going to be product development, which is what I've primarily been engaged in the last 10 years. It doesn't mean that I've not been working with operations, maintenance, support, all that stuff, but 90% of the teams I've been working with is within the product development space or building new value from an IT perspective. Also, today is my personal view on Kanban, which might or might not be aligned with what everybody else is thinking. So bear that in mind, please. Start up with an introduction. That's what we're doing right now. Then I'm going to talk a bit about abusing Kanban. David mentioned this morning that even the people abusing Kanban or doing it wrong are still getting a lot of good things out of it. My old boss used to tell me that there's something called a meatball rule, meaning that if there's a meatball right in front of you, and you have a fork, then you should grab it. And it seems that a lot of people are they have the fork in their hands, the meatball is right in front of them on the plate, but they're just not grabbing it. So that's going to be the concept of today's talk. How can we grab that meatball in a simple way when we've already got the fork in our hands? We'll then look at Kanban from a Scrum perspective, mainly because that's an easy way to communicate the 6 core principles in a way that everybody can understand. And then we'll get into some questions at the end if we have a few minutes left for that. Okay, this is the blog that got me here. I was so tired of reading all the same questions and all the wrong answers to Kanban on the various social media, LinkedIn, different forums. So I thought, could I write a blog in a few pages that would exemplify how I view Kanban and how we should use these basic principles to get much more value out of our service deliveries. So if you've already read my blog, then you'll see that there's quite a lot of repetition in today's talk. Being a bit nerdy about this, of course, the teams and organizations I work with, we have big visual boards. There's an example from a company using Rally, but it could be essentially anything from big white boards to all the good tools that David also mentioned in the talk this morning. Again, being nerdy, of course, I've got my own personal Kanban board as well to set up, making sure that I do not try to promise more than I've proven to be able to deliver on the personal level. And then at some point I thought, my God, this would be a really good idea to take this back home to make sure that my girlfriend cannot put more work onto me during the weekend that I've proven to be able to deliver. And it's actually working quite well, so especially the limiting of ideas in the column to the left. So yes, that might be a brilliant idea. What idea are you prepared to remove from this backlog to make sure that we do not overload our system in the family? And with 2 small kids, there's an absolute limit as to how much of that actually gets completed. So we don't want to plan too far ahead either, because then suddenly it's winter and you do not actually need the playhouse in the garden anymore. That being said, I'm quite frustrated. Again, back to the meatball, which seems to be right in front of people, and people seem to be talking about that meatball as being anything else. Or either they're talking about it as being a kind of sushi, or they're talking about it being really, really far away when actually it's right in front of them, or in all cases. And I'm actually doing two things with this slide. First of all, I'm telling you guys that I'm frustrated, and also placing a kitten right in front of you. And as we all know, having cute small animals on a slide during the presentation is going to make it a much more enjoyable presentation from you. There's actually science saying that if you look at a picture of a cute animal every day, you're going to be 12% more productive. These are the core principles, or I know I'm supposed to call them practices. I've just never gotten used to using that word. To me, there are still principles where the practice underneath might be using a specific board or something to visualize, but let's not get too much into that part. I also see them as a set of game-changing beliefs. So if we're using this, we're choosing to believe that this is going to make the world a better place. So we're also choosing to not spend a whole lot of time discussing whether it makes sense to visualize something on a board, to limit work in progress, to make our process policies explicit. So these are beliefs we choose to believe in, and I think that's an important statement to make. It's also a lens through which we see the world. And that's where sometimes it gets mixed up. Because if we do not talk about this as a lens, if we start out by talking this as very specific practices, as pulling one user story at the time, then we forget that we're actually looking at through a lens, focusing us on what we think would be the most important thing to optimize for the current moment. And again, if we start out by discussing whether it makes sense to pull a batch of user stories or a single user story at a time, we sometimes forget that these are core beliefs, these are core principles, and it's a lens through which we want to see the world. It doesn't have to be that complicated in real life. The problem with this lens is that these principles are getting misrepresented. You're probably all familiar with the case where you're discussing Kanban, and people are telling you, yeah, that's good and fine, it's for manufacturing work, we can do this, but you shouldn't really use this in a product development context where the world is quite different from trying to do the same car over and over again. Of course, it's a problem from our perspective because it makes it very hard to communicate what we're actually trying to do. It's kind of self-inflicted because we kind of chose to adopt the word Kanban, which to the rest of the world, even though I'm sure the word itself and the use of it is 300 years old, it was still very much integrated into lean manufacturing at that time. So it's our responsibility to add the explanation that we're using Kanban in different contexts from a different perspective than you are in manufacturing. It's not the manufacturing world's fault that they were there first and they've been using this word for 50 years to describe optimization of manufacturing production lines. This is basically me 5 years ago. So I was sick and tired of seeing Scrum teams fail. I was sick and tired of seeing them overcommit to their sprints, setting aside knowledge sharing, pair programming, whatever they had set in place to reach some desired sprint commitment that were unrealistic anyway. So I went on a war at some point against Scrum. And you could see some of my presentation from 5 years ago would be, Scrum is not agile. Don't use Scrum as a religion and stuff like that. And probably at that time, it was like a teenager that was trying to rebel against the adults around him. Basically, this is not a very good way of communicating to the world. There's a better way sometimes to do stuff. And if we're using Kanban primarily as a tool to try to bash something else, then again, we're totally forgetting about this being a lens through which we see the world. And through that lens, we could be looking at Scrum, we could be looking at Waterfall, we could be looking at a lean startup, we could be looking at anything. The lens still makes very much sense. The set of core beliefs are still there. But if we're doing it from the perspective of telling other people that they're wrong, then basically we are totally forgetting about the core principle of evolutionary change. So let's stop discussing whether it's a good thing to pull a sprint at a time, whether it's a good thing to replenish your queue in 2-week sequences. Let's start talking about what are we using as the lens through which we see the world and what is the most important problem to focus on. And from the last 5 years of experience, often it's not the case of whether you pull 2 weeks of work or a single user story that's your primary bottleneck as for the moment. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. The slides? Yeah, somebody asked me to put it on a USB stick afterwards, so I'm sure they will be. It's also miscommunicated in the sense that that at least many people keep telling themselves, Scrum, Agile, whatever is really good if you're doing new development, and if you're doing maintenance operations with standard small-sized bug fixes, then Kanban is a really good fit. Again, it's totally missing the concept of the lens through which we see the world, in which we try to look at process optimization from an overall perspective. So it's not that Kanban is a bad fit for a support team or for a maintenance operations team. It's just that it's not at all the only fit. Then some will tell you, yeah, we've got these really hardcore gates. We like to plan everything up front, and then we want to pull things through a stage gate model. It seems that Scrum is a really bad fit for this type of context. Can Kanban help you? And someone will say, yeah, Kanban is an excellent fit. What we want to do with Kanban is exactly a sequence of development where we put up really hard interfaces between these gates, and we make sure that we pull everything at once to make for the theoretically worst possible flow through this organization. Let's stop talking about Kanban as a way of optimizing for the worst theoretical flow we could possibly gain by using a stage gate model. Yes, it might be that this is your current situation. It might be that this is what you're starting from. But again, if you're looking at this from a flow perspective, it's a horrible way to do things. You cannot possibly be slower in getting feedback. And one of the 6 core principles is feedback loops throughout your process. And then, I'm sure some of you have heard the argument, with Kanban, you do not estimate. What? What on earth, looking through the Kanban lens, focusing on the 6 principles, will tell you that you cannot estimate? I've yet to see that note somewhere in the Kanban books or in the Kanban material. Again, it should be naturally part of the context if it's already there, and you should seriously challenge that with everything else, whether it makes sense. Again, my assumption will be that for most product development, yes, it does make sense, simply from the perspective that we still got the core principle of value trumping flow. So if we're not working on something that's valuable enough, and yes, cost will always be uncertain, lead time will be uncertain, but if we do not know, well, this is 50 times larger than this, then we might not be able to make the good trade-off, well, this is actually something we don't want to work on in the first place. We've got methods now so that sizing things, estimating things, both in terms of time and budget, is purely a data exercise almost, so that the actual estimation session might be 0.2% of the total cost of developing something. I actually timed estimation sessions to come up with that number, so it's not nothing that's randomly picked out. So yes, it might be that you're in a situation where you're spending way too much time doing estimation and sizing, but that doesn't mean that estimation and sizing is irrelevant, and it doesn't mean specifically that Kanban is telling you, do not estimate. And then we have the situation where Kanban is used primarily to tell other people that it's your fault. Look at this, we visualized our board, and we're totally going to disregard the system perspective, and we're going to look at you as a person. See, what we did with Kanban was we made up this nice engine to be able to place blame exactly in the right place. And by telling you that it's your fault and you're wrong, we're not going to overburden the system, and we're going to optimize for flow throughout the value chain. Probably not. So again, let's stop using Kanban as a way of trying to visualize a sequence of work so that we can place blame on some individual function. Remember, when we're visualizing our workflow, we're talking about workflow steps, information discovery activities. We're not talking about individual roles. And I found that Kanban is being misrepresented to the degree where, well, this specific mindset, in many cases where people have adopted Kanban or some of the Kanban mechanics, this has totally vanished. I don't know whether Mike Burrows came up with this, but he's the one I've heard it from, and basically states, Kanban is about optimizing for the continuous flow of customer recognized value, know what you're delivering to whom and why. Very, very simple, put this way. But most are still not even focusing on this issue. They don't care what they're delivering. It's not even customer value. It's a sequence of post-its that's going across a board, and nobody really knows what happens to those post-its after they're done. They don't even care. It's just put on a long list of an inventory somewhere in the organization where pretty much nobody cares what happens afterwards. If you ask the individual person working on these items, they won't be able to explain to you, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Who am I delivering this to? So again, if we're looking through the Kanban lens, we should be able to answer these very, very simple questions. Again, if we're not doing that, we're leaving that meatball right in front of us on the table, because we start immediately to dive into being able to make history distribution diagrams over medium-sized tickets which are not valuable to anybody. Value trumps flow, remember. So being a bit provocative on this, I would find that many Kanban initiatives, though if you ask people, they will answer that they're much better off using the Kanban mechanics that they are right now, still very much in the cargo cult trench. All familiar with the cargo cult metaphor? If you're not, please raise your hands. I'll spend 30 seconds. Okay, so some. Simply put, during the Second World War, the American military was based on some Pacific islands, and after the World War ended, they packed up their stuff, went home, and some people went out to study the effect of having these American bases on these Pacific islands on the native people living there. And they saw some really weird behavior. They saw landing fields that were cleared, even though no planes were ever going to arrive. They saw what looked like radio towers built out of bamboo, native people talking into coconuts as it was radios. And they found out that what the native people was trying to do was recreate the situation where the American military was there, because at that point they got some free clothes, they got some free food, they got some free tools. And naturally, they didn't know that they had to start World War III to get them back there. Because had they done that, they probably would have done something different than talking into coconuts. But again, we should be careful that we're not ending up in the same place as those native, walking in the jungle in some formation, trying to march like the American military to recreate a situation that we've seen that somebody else had success having a big visual board. We do not care what's actually on that board. We're flowing tickets, which just post-its. There's no value attached to those, but we're doing exactly like the team next to us. And since they were so hugely successful and they managed to optimize for increasing their productivity 3 times, if we just replicate their practices without understanding the underlying mindset, we're probably going to get the same result. No, we're probably going to march around in the jungle like the native people on the Pacific Islands. And then you have the consultant visiting you, and he will tell you, yeah, but that's natural because you're not doing it right. So we can easily tick off the things that you're doing right according to the book, and then we can tell you that some things are wrong here, and if you just do these things right, then you'll be in the same place as those guys next to you. Wrong. And we've seen this before. Probably you recognize, if you've been consulting in the Agile space, as I have for years, visiting failed Scrum implementations, it's pretty easy to tick off what's wrong there. And if you go even a bit further back, it was even easier, because that was in the good old extreme programming days, where it was much easier, because that was simply impossible for 99% of all companies to achieve. So it was so easy to come in and say, oh yeah, your problem is that you're just doing it wrong. And let's find out where this incredibly fragile house of cards is not working for you, and let's try to fix that small problem, and everything will be perfect. Again, wrong. My personal experience is that we need to continuously put equal effort into communicating both the Kanban hows and the Kanban whys. And if we do not do this, if we do not continuously balance those 3 aspects in our communication, in our coaching, in trying to help teams, organization adapt for a better way of working, then we're going to miss out again on that meatball that's going to be right in front. You cannot start only with the mindset issues, because if people have no practices, no tools, no way of trying to learn, then you're just going to stay on the mindset level. You're not ever going to get anywhere. Neither can you only work with the tool level. It doesn't make sense to just talk about people visualizing work on a board, having whip limits, if they have no idea why that situation, those practices can help them. And again, they will forget right about 5 minutes after they leave the training. So if nobody's there in the daily work to remind them why we're doing this, what the purpose is, then again, we're going to leave that meatball right there in front of us at the table. I've found that one of the easiest ways of showing this is trying to look at a typical Scrum setup through the Kanban lens. Let's try to do that. I'm sure they apologize for the hammering going on upstairs. So hopefully most of you recognize this is a pretty simplified Scrum board. And again, instead of telling them this is wrong, you should be doing something totally different, this is great. Guys, you have taken your first steps to understanding what's actually going on in your organization. This is a great starting point. You're starting to actually see what's going on. What used to be something hidden on an individual computer, now we can start to talk about it, now we can start to coordinate it. But something is missing here. If you try to ask ourselves, what is flowing to whom and why, then it seems that not all work is actually visible on this particular board. And it might be that quite a lot of work is actually not visible on this particular board. It might be that quite a lot of time and energy has been put into stuff that has not even arrived on this board yet, which could potentially be our largest bottleneck, where most time is invested, most time is lost due to inefficiency, some things not being aligned, not communicated to the outside world, etc., etc. And try to imagine a theoretical context where the Scrum team does not deliver directly to production with validated value. I know in your company, if you're using Scrum, you're probably doing that, but there are other companies outside you in the real world where they do not actually deliver every single sprint into production and have validated the business value right after that. Meaning that potentially we could actually just be delivering to a big pile of inventory where nobody really cares what happens. I visited a Scrum team once. They were doing fine. Pretty stable velocity, meeting at least half of their sprint commitments, doing well. And I asked them, what about the feedback from your customer? How's that going? It's going great. There's none. Okay, that sounds interesting. Yeah, we are just hitting the mark every single time. Okay, that's really interesting because the rest of the world typically do not have that likelihood of hitting the target every single time. And it turned out that during the last half a year, 70% of what they've built had never been touched by a single user. Simply because there was a break in the communication they were doing internal IT from delivering this to the people that were going to take this and actually put it into use. So again, they were just delivering at a very stable rate, a lot of waste at that point. So let's look at the entire workflow and not just the individual development silo, because it's likely you're going to focus on the totally wrong things. It might be that actually out of all this pile that we've built, only a few things actually generated a healthy return on investment. And that those are the things we actually focus on to tell us something about what should we do next. Again, back to David's simple principles from this morning's keynote. So again, instead of blaming them, judging that this is wrong, let's see if we can try to optimize for end-to-end flow and not just a silo. Let's put up a bigger board. Let's see what's actually going on in our system so we can start to talk about the real issues and what's really going on. Why are we using our staging environment, in this particular case, as an inventory? It seems that we're delivering lots of good stuff here and then it just stops. Nobody's really closing the feedback loop. Nobody's evaluating whether this makes sense. Something is broken, and it has nothing to do with what's going on inside the sprint. It's actually something that's going on afterwards. Let's talk about that. Not from the perspective of judging whether things are right or wrong, but from the perspective of actual process improvement. It doesn't matter if you're delivering 100 story points every sprint if those 100 story points are just ending up in an inventory and no user is ever going to have the chance to touch them. And again, when we're doing this, stop the whole blame game of what we're doing when we're doing an end-to-end visualization is sequencing work into some gates. That's not what's happening. An actual Kanban board will show you exactly how the process functions right now. And if that's a gate model, if that's a lot of handoffs in between different areas of specialization, that's your current state. Might be that's good in your particular organization, or it might not. But you should care about what's actually going on end-to-end. That's the first step. Somebody in your organization should actually care. What happens from somebody starts to make the decision to put time and energy into building something, and until somebody has actually validated whether this was time spent. So it's not about trying to make the world more sequential, less sequential, more agile, more iterative. It's just about representing what is actually going on in your system and having those, each column be a theme for that perspective. And it's not about that we should find some issues that are wrong in test and then throw them right back to the end of the backlog because now we have to reprioritize everything. It's in the workflow. We can do lots of development, bug fixing, updating specifications, whatever we want in the test column. And then let's not talk about whether it's a good thing to do sprints or not initially. Let's talk about how great it is that this particular Scrum team is actually using the sprint as a WIP limiter. Great, guys. You're actually making it hard to overburden yourself because if you're just a little bit disciplined, you're using your velocity to indicate how much can we actually pull in to the next sprint to avoid overburdening in this team doing more than they have been proven to be able to handle. It might be that in the future you can do better than that and you can pull less at the time and you can be more flow-based, but let's not talk about that right now. Let's talk about that this is a great situation, but there also seems to be some areas we can improve because something seems to happen every single time. And that is we're not only pulling things into a plan in a sprint planning meeting, which is essentially just a 2-week cadence of replenishing your input queue. We're also starting everything at the same time, which might end up having some consequences because sometimes we're not actually able to finish everything. And sometimes it's better to have finished our 8 out of 10 and actually have some potential value to deliver than it is being half started on all of it. And it seems, guys, that this is not the only area of optimization. We're doing exactly the same thing in other areas of this particular system. So let's again talk about those issues, not from a judgment perspective, but from the actual perspective of trying to optimize for end-to-end flow. So again, let's talk about the real problems. Let's use the core lens, the principles of Kanban, to drive the right type of process improvement. Not the blame game type, but looking at the system and identifying where could we spend our effort on process optimization so that we can get the most value out of it. We don't have to blame Scrum to do that. And again, most teams working with Scrum will have some definition of ready, some definition of done. Let's talk about that as a great thing. So guys, you have just made your first step towards aligning your process policies. This is a really great thing from a Kanban perspective. But again, it seems that things are not always as good as it seems because sometimes we experience that things arrive in the done column and we haven't not exactly fulfilled our definition of done. Not because we're terrible at our work, but because something is maybe pressuring us. Maybe we're doing it in a batch. Maybe we're doing too much at the same time, which makes it hard for the tester to do all the work of a test in 1 hour before the sprint demo. Could we do something to help this out? And could we do the same when it happens that it seems that even though we've pulled this into a sprint, it's in the sprint backlog, it's actually not that ready. And that seems to be generating some problems because one of the problems and one of the reasons why we're continuously putting everything in progress at the same time is that there are lots of clarifications that are not in place. So it's not actually possible for things to flow through our sprint. Maybe that's because we have some process policies that we're not actually aligned against. And again, we can help you with that. We can try to find out where in your actual workflow are these process policies applied most effectively. So it's no longer just a batch of input and exit criteria. We're trying to level the flow of process policies so that they actually belong to the workflow step where we can do something about it before it's too late. So for example, if we're not able to put anything in the sprint ready queue, then probably we're not going to have that much of a successful sprint planning meeting. Again, it's just a flow issue. We do not need to make any adjustments. We can just look at the flow and see there's actually a problem. And if we're really mature, we'll start to integrate process policies like, yes, we're in this together. Yes, we're not optimizing for individual silos, and we're actually optimizing for maintaining responsibility for something from starting it and until delivering out to end customers. And if we're really, really mature, we're even starting to focus on, did we actually have a fit-for-purpose system? Are the actual end users using the software? Are the customers that paid for it, are they happy with the software? And again, those are the hard questions to start to ask, because it's quite easy to agree on doing something and then getting it out onto a production environment. It's much harder to talk about, yeah, it seemed we spent 200,000 Danish kroner on this feature, but right now nobody's really using it. So we have 4,000 live users every day, and we have around three of those on average clicking the actual button, enabling this feature to even start to be used. And it might be that those 3 clicks are actually ourselves, because we went in there and tested the system ourselves. So let's talk about those issues. But we can only start to talk about those issues if we can see that it doesn't stop at things being in production. Again, the team having delivered to production on a bi-weekly basis for 6 months, and 70% of that was just using the production environment as an inventory for things that were never used. Let's stop that, and let's talk about what can we do to actually close the end-to-end feedback loop. And again, talking about flow, let's talk about how great it is that the Scrum team is starting to focus on flow. Starting to focus on starting something and without too much delay, delivering something 2 weeks after. That is great. Great work, guys. It might just be that we could do something that's even better. Because first of all, it turns out that some of this was kind of fake, because not all of it was actually really finished. And everybody was sitting there feeling overburdened, having a bad conscience, because while they were starting up the next sprint, they were spending the first 3 or 4 days finishing off what was actually from the previous sprint, but it was already ticked off in the backlog as something that was sprint done. So again, let's find a system that makes it possible to talk about that. And let's talk about the same thing happening on the product owner side. They have 25 items that are on some level of being prepared for the upcoming sprint, and they have a capacity of 5 to do in that actual sprint. That's a problem from a flow perspective. You're investing huge amounts of time and money trying to optimize for getting more things ready than you have the capacity to handle. So let's use something to try to help us optimize for end-to-end flow. And then Kanban is a perfect example of how we can turn our attention to this. And I've done this for many Scrum teams now, and I have yet to see any negative reaction towards wanting to optimize for end-to-end. I've seen product owners think, why on earth have we been working for 3 years and my work was never ever visible to the rest of the team and the rest of the organization? How could we ever get into a situation where all we paid attention to was a small silo of the workflow, things that were going on within a sprint? How could we not be looking at both all the work I put into preparing for these sprints and all the work that actually was left but everybody forgot about in terms of closing the feedback loop after the sprint? Let's look at end-to-end delivery now, guys. It totally turns around the whole team perspective. And as some of you might remember, the Scrum Guide literally states a Scrum team consists of a product owner, a Scrum Master, and a delivery team of 3 to 9 people. It does not say the Scrum team consists of a delivery team of 3 to 9 people. So it's the entire team, and those are the guys we're trying to optimize for. That's part of the Scrum framework. People are just not using it. I've even had organizations where there's a war between these. Within the team, there's simply a war where the Scrum Master will protect the team from the product owner so that he has no chance in hell of getting things ready for the next sprint. That's not end-to-end flow optimization. So let's talk about, for this particular team, what's really going on. Let's talk about this team being overburdened in several areas of the system. And let's talk about what is the most problematic area to address right now. Again, we're not challenging the Scrum. You can still do Scrum by the book, but you can still get a lot of good options to discuss process optimization and improve your system end to end. And it gets even worse for this particular team, because it seems that they're not actually that predictable. It was not actually the case that they had a stable velocity and they were able to predict anything beyond the next sprint, because it turns out that lots and lots of things are being worked on where nobody really knows what to do, make of this. So they have some things that are bugs that are there from actual users being affected in production, and those are prioritized in the backlog. They're working on those in the sprint as well. They also have stuff that's really just issues found on staging environments that are also suddenly prioritized in the backlog, even though it's just a signal that they're not really finished with this stuff yet. But again, you'll get these if you start to sub-optimize for silo optimization within the sprint, because the whole framework around what you're doing is trying to optimize for delivering in a small particular part of the system. So again, let's help raise that dialogue. And why not just visualize what's actually going on? That many of the things you're working on are actually just things you haven't finished yet. So from an end-to-end workflow perspective, these are not new valuable items. These are just existing items that happen to be able to make it through sprint done, but you've just not finished that. And oh my God, what did Ken Schwaber write in the original, one of the original Scrum books from I think 2003? Yes, the team should expect to spend around 20% of their sprint capacity actually closing the feedback loop on what was delivered in the previous sprint. So we're not even challenging the Scrum framework here. We're just accepting that it's a natural part of the sprint, that some of your time will be spent finishing up what turned out actually not to be finished yet. And we're embracing change from a Scrum perspective as well, so it's not even a mindset problem. But again, looking at only what's going on in a particular part of the system will make us optimize for a lot of things that seem relevant, that seem to be the right thing to do, but really turn out to be wrong. The same, let's talk about this team being incredibly good at optimizing for flow, because they're literally tracking what's going on in their system. They're tracking their sprint burn down, which is a good first step towards thinking about how you can measure flow. But we can help you guys do even better. Why not get some flow diagrams in there where we can actually see what's going on overall, where we can give the product owners, and even if we have some product managers, the chance to shine to the outside organization, showing them that actually they have a huge potential for delivering some statistics, some signals to the outside world in terms of how this agile project is doing, that agile projects in general can be much more predictable than any gate model, because we're actually able to finish things early, and we're able to measure how long that took. And for most organizations I work with that are really project-based, we do one of these for time, and we do one of those for budget, because those are typically the two things that are most interesting. And we can do this even if we haven't got an electronic tool. We can do this spending 5 or 10 minutes a week updating these simple figures. And we can talk about some cycle time diagrams. We can talk about, it's funny guys, you work in 2-week sprints, and some of our stuff has lead times of plus 200 days. That seems like not a good fit for the Scrum container. What's going on here? It seems that you're pretending to do time box delivery, but actually things are being left, things are being forgotten, and there's not really the flow that you expected of the system working like this. So it seems that your bi-weekly replenishment meeting is not working as intended. Let's talk about those issues. So very briefly, please don't, when you're applying Kanban to a system, focus narrowly on individual silos and pretend to be optimizing for end-to-end flow. Somebody should care. And if nobody else cares, and you're looking at this, then you're that person. And it's not that it's easy. It could be something that's politically out of your control right now. It could be something that's not even been addressed yet, but somebody should care. Otherwise, you'll be doing what they did before they introduced lean in manufacturing. You'll just be making sure that this expensive machine goes faster than the rest of the organization. Meaning that you'll just be overproducing and putting things on a big inventory that's going to be incredibly expensive to address later on. Please don't claim that Kanban mandates that you should only pull one user story or one item at the time. There's nothing stating that. You can pull 10, you can pull 15, you can pull a week's work, or you can just pull the one if you're really flow-based. I know where my preference is, but I also know that whether or not to do Scrum might not be what's actually a deciding factor for most organizations right now. They're not anywhere near at the maturity level where whether they pull 2 weeks of work or whether they pull a single user story is going to be the deciding factor. Let's address the real problems. Again, that's the whole idea of looking through the Kanban lens. Let's not address all those problems that are relevant right now from an end-to-end perspective. Don't use Kanban as a bad excuse for optimizing for utilization. So that's sometimes what we see if we do not even care about the end-to-end workflow, but we start to see everything in the organization as a shared service. We do not even challenge the assumption that it's a good idea to have everything as a shared service and have everybody overproducing to everybody else. Again, let's try to address the real problems before we decide how we should align. Please don't ignore value and make it a posted race. If you're working on something and nobody can tell you who is this for, who is going to get value out of it, it doesn't matter how much you track. It doesn't matter your flow diagrams. It doesn't matter your cycle time diagrams. If you're not producing value, if what you're flowing through the system is not something that's valuable for anybody, then essentially it doesn't matter. And please do not dive too quickly into the advanced mechanics. Again, we've seen lots and lots of those presented in the keynote this morning. All great stuff, all really, really useful, but it is attached to a maturity level of the organization. And if you cannot even get the basics to work, then chances are that doing all the advanced stuff is not going to benefit you a lot. Address the right bottlenecks first, also in terms of process optimization. My personal guidelines, and you can choose to ignore them or use them, care about the end-to-end workflow. We are flowing value, not post-its. Why and how should be continuously connected, but not through judgment. Feedback loops on the actual fitness of our system in terms of whether people like what this system is producing or not. Is it valuable from a customer, from an end user perspective, is by far the most important feedback loop, but also by far the most difficult feedback loop. Most, if you're working in development, most need some elements of sizing, simply also sometimes to avoid blocking your system for huge amounts of times and losing your flexibility. If you don't know and you're dragging in or pulling in 3 large, then essentially you could be blocking your system for the next 3 weeks, being unable to adjust, be adaptable, do anything other than what was planned. And do not start wars. Kanban is bigger than that. We do not actually need to challenge whether Scrum or not Scrum is the right thing right now. For 95% of the organizations I've worked with, that is not their problem. We can adapt so that it'll be easier for them to do Scrum, but we do not need to challenge the basic assumptions of whether using a Scrum Master, product owner, etc. is a good idea or not. We're bigger than that. The irony of this, 2015, I'm pretty sure my success story of 2015 is going to be a Scrum initiative. If somebody had told me that 5 years ago, I would have said that can never happen in a million years. But right now we have a whole organization that is essentially optimizing for flow, looking at the right metrics, looking at the right way of optimizing, looking at value, how it's flowing through the entire system. And yes, they're committed to using Scrum by the book. But really, it's from the core things in the Scrum guide, which are really not that specific. Scrum is still just a management framework, and it only addresses a few parts of what we're trying to optimize for. So sometimes you don't even need to talk about Kanban. So again, I'm pretty sure my biggest success in 2015 in terms of Kanban is going to be an initiative where nobody has any clue that what they're optimizing for are the 6 core principles of Kanban. Because it's just it's just been introduced as a natural part of process optimization to look at this stuff. I've become a huge fan of the Toyota Kata framework. A warning though, it's not entirely an evolutionary approach. But if you have not yet read Mark Ruther's book, do that, or at least look into some of the work Håkan Fors has done from the Kanban perspective on this. It's simply brilliant. And you'll never transition an organization as quick to a more experimental, trying out different process optimization efforts than you can do with this framework. It's just been mind-blowing how much it can do. Good. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. And just a final note, if you have questions or you want to call me, go ahead and do that. It's a free one because nobody ever does anyway, but now at least you had the chance.